as a product stack, we think that initial rollups are the most flexible, but also the most product ready.
Fragmentation actually kind of arises not necessarily from the initial asset type or like the liquidity of the asset specifically. I think it actually arises from basically like the underlying infrastructure, right? If it's difficult to move assets between different chains, especially in like this app chain based world, you naturally will have some sort of like fragmentation.
I think a vast majority of Rollups as a service, they charge dollars to use their infrastructure. And that's kind of not something that we want to do. Rather, we're just trying to grow like the collective pie and create more value for Initia as a whole and its stakers, which is incredibly nice.
Welcome to the Interop. Today, my guests are Stan and Ezaan of the founding team of Initia. Initia is a new layer 1 chain that enables a network of interwoven rollups. What I find really interesting about Initia is that developers can build applications in 3 VMs currently, the EVM, Cosm, Wasm, and the MoveVM, maybe someday some other VMs. But what's really interesting is that all of the applications, regardless of the VM in which the application is written, are compatible and interoperable with each other. There's lots to talk about the infrastructure and also the product that they're building here. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to get notified when new episodes drop every week. And remember, none of what we discuss here on the Interop is investment advice. If you enjoyed this content, please consider staking with us. We're validating on a handful of networks. Just look for Interop in the active set. Hey guys, thanks for joining me.
Good morning, sir. Thanks for having us. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, really excited to be here as well.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to ask you, like, how did you come to work on this problem? At which point did you say, we need another product that enables people to build rollups?
Right. Yep. That's a good question. So we'll walk you through a little bit of the backstory here. Essentially, Dan and I, we used to work in the Cosmos ecosystem for a long time. Back during the last cycle, we saw basically the rise of it, as well as the fall after the Terra collapse. And I think Cosmos was always the most interesting tech stack to build in because it was the most flexible framework to build unique blockchains. That is the case everywhere, right? Anyone that's building something innovative comes to Cosmos, whether that be something like Berachain or Celestia or things like Osmosis. The problem has always been within Cosmos that a few different things. The first was it's just difficult to bootstrap a layer 1. You have to deal with the validator set. You have to inflate your token supply. You don't really have control over all those parameters. And then typically it's a bit slower than how rollups operate. And it's just like a heavy load for anyone to do. But app chains have so many benefits to them. You're able to control your own boundaries. You can set what you want to exist on that chain. You can change the way that transactions are ordered. There's just so many benefits. But within Cosmos, there's just a whole slew of fragmentation. And I think that has to do with IBC's pairwise dependency problems, but also the way that just the ecosystem evolved over time. So many different teams tried to become the hub. And now you basically have like tens of maintainers for the same pieces of infrastructure. Conversely, we saw the rise of rollups happening on Ethereum. This allowed teams to build chains really easily, really quickly. You can do it in a click of a button with these RaaS services. But the problem is that you get a copy-paste fork of the exact same chain. The only thing you can do is add a custom gas token. So if you're trying to build something novel when it comes to like the actual architecture stack, it's a whole custom build, and that's like not an easy feat by any means. And these chains on Ethereum as well, they're still isolated, they're still fragmented. You still have to talk to third-party bridge providers, get Oracle services, and in an increasingly modular landscape, we think that this problem is only going to become worse and worse over time as you have tens of DA layers, 15 interoperability solutions that all create new token standards. Like, this problem does get worse. And so Ethereum's original scaling vision was to use sharding, so really never had rollups planned into the roadmap. And now we're kind of in this rollup-centric future where we think there's going to be thousands of them. And so we decided that there needs to be an architecture stack that kind of knows that there's going to be a rollup-centric future and is built for that in mind. And so when we approached Initia, we thought, how can we rebuild this entire system, combining what we learned from the Cosmos side and its flexibility with the ease of rollups on Ethereum, and then piecing in modular aspects, but in a way that doesn't break composability, that doesn't break fungibility, that makes it still very easy for users to build. And we thought that the architecture stack itself is not the end game. Like, architecture is built to allow these applications to run, but it's really important to have a good product stack and a good economic framework on top of all of this. We need to tie the entire ecosystem together in this new multi-chain world that we're essentially trying to create.
Yeah, interesting. One thing that I wanted to ask you guys, I mean, you guys are building essentially a framework for building applications, or a platform for building decentralized applications. What I've noticed is that we're, I think, safely now in a bull market, in the beginning of a bull market. I think a lot of people expect, the cycle to go on for at least another year, maybe into 2025, 2020, like late 2025. And what I've seen is lots of infrastructure still being built. A lot of layer ones, roll-up as a service platforms, modular frameworks, DA layers, restaking. Investors are investing in a lot of infrastructure. I mean, as a fund, we're investing in infrastructure. There haven't been so far, like, except for meme coins and maybe some new NFTs, there aren't that many really innovative applications, I think. DPIN is interesting, but DPIN has been around actually for a long time. It's just been kind of like rebranded now as DPIN. When are we going to see the applications? And what's Initia doing to really, get developers to start building applications instead of like building more infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's like a really interesting question. And I do agree that like the majority of the value accrues on the application layer. The applications are the parts of the, like, let's say, infrastructure stack that actually directly interacts with the end users themselves, right? While we are providing a lot of this underlying infrastructure, one of our biggest focuses here at Initia is basically enabling these applications to be able to really reach out to their users, have an interesting product to use. And so that's why we've been spending a lot of time, especially now that we're currently live on Testnet, with some of our initial teams, which have a bunch of different types of products across different verticals, whether it be DeFi, SocialFi, etc. Making sure that they're able to leverage like the opportunity of Initia's public testnet launch to actually, kind of test their product against these users who are getting interested in Initia themselves. And so we've been basically, putting all of our like strength as well as a lot of our time helping these teams get ready to launch when we do actually launch on mainnet as well.
Yeah, cool. We'll talk about the applications a little bit later. There's one thing I wanted to ask you guys about, like, just kind of getting your pulse on this. I think if we, we're talking about app chains now, but app chains as we describe them today, I think encompass something a lot broader than what we thought app chains were maybe just 3 years ago, or even during the time of Terra. Like, an app chain used to be a chain that runs, well, the Cosmos SDK, because mostly that whole thesis came from there, has its own validator set, and like really controls every level of the stack from the security all the way to the application layer. Now, people use the word app chain to also describe applications that leverage other forms of underlying security. So that might be a Cosmos SDK chain utilizing replicated security or partial set security on Cosmos. It might be an application on Initia that is leveraging Initia's validator set. It could be, an app using eigenlayer restaking, where the security of the chain is secured by Ethereum, restaked ETH. Is it useful to differentiate app chains in the traditional sense and this new sort of application that might control its execution environment and have a lot of control over that aspect of the chain, but leverages someone else's security. In the same way that, you might say that, a city leverages, like a city is not a nation. It's not fully sovereign from the perspective that it doesn't, it usually doesn't like operate its own military. But a city state might, I mean, this is not a perfect analogy, but I think that analogy has been used quite a bit in Cosmos to describe like how chains are secured. Yeah, just open question for you guys.
For the most part, I think more terms is bad because for the end user or just like regular people who are trying to learn things, really most of these things are very similar. Um, in that sense, I think app chain is a very versatile term. I think it refers to any chain that has one core focus or one sole mandate of what they're trying to build around. And so I think whether that be a rollup, a sovereign rollup, a ZK one, a optimistic one that has replicated security or its own validator set, I think those can all be considered app chains just fine. I think on Initia, we view these app chains, if you want to go back to your city state analogy, as like more so like a state within one country. So if you imagined Initia as like the US, we want to build the federal level as Initia, so we control things like the transport layer as well as like some of the monetary policies. But each state is still its own state. They're able to work towards their own goals, but they still have the underlying collective of the entire nation to fight for. And that's what some of our economic mechanisms that we've built directly do, because I think that has been a big problem for app chains, like systems of app chains in the past. If you look at Cosmos, I think one of the biggest problems is that Atom was never really pushed into these other states. And because of that, you have all this tribalism, and no one really cares about the hub. Conversely, if you look at rollup stacks and rollups on Ethereum, everyone cares about ETH a little bit. Everyone cares about Solana despite being different applications. And so how can we create mechanisms that do the same thing across 1,000 rollups in the future on Initia?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. So like the federal and state level. So from that perspective, and I think what I'm taking away here is that application chains should be defined more by their output function. So like, what is the thing that this chain or this app does, as opposed to its level of control over the stack. And so therefore, things like the Cosmos Hub or Solana or like these infrastructure chains are not app chains in themselves, since they are not like producing a singular application, but rather like a multitude of applications.
I don't think it has to be a singular application, but I would say having a singular goal or like a something that they're striving towards. So the Cosmos Hub is an app chain because its goal is provide security to other application chains.
Yeah, that gets murky though. I don't know. I get that we shouldn't add more terms, but it's like saying AWS is the same thing as Facebook. I don't know. Like you have you have applications and then you have infrastructure. But anyway, I think this is like a whole debate that maybe we can have at some other time. You guys have talked a lot about fragmentation. I've heard you guys talk on other podcasts about like how Cosmos is fragmented. And, I think not having a singular token that acts as the money for the entire system is one of the reasons why that is. Like I just watched Sunny give a talk, I think on like I can't remember which podcast, but, he's talking about how, Bitcoin should be one of the monetary assets of the Cosmos ecosystem, and how like they're bringing Bitcoin in. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense and would really help the Cosmos ecosystem. What's your view on fragmentation? How do we get here, and like how do we solve it? Because there are more application chains that are going live, and I'm not talking about the roll-up Initia variety. I'm talking about like full-fledged application chains that have their own staking token and that continue to to bring more fragmentation to the space. So how do we address this?
Yeah, so I think fragmentation actually kind of arises not necessarily from the initial asset type or like the liquidity of the asset specifically. I think it actually arises initially from basically like the underlying infrastructure, right? If it's difficult to move assets between different chains, especially in like this app chain based world, you naturally will have some sort of like fragmentation, and then you'll have like a very difficult time choosing what is like the canonical asset for a specific ecosystem, right? It's a little bit easier for things like Ethereum because like Ethereum existed much longer before like these rollups started appearing, right? So then, Ethereum just became the canonical choice. But if you go to like a Cosmos like ecosystem, like the initial goal was to have a bunch of these like different chains, right? With like a hub and spoke model. So everybody's they have like political interests, right? Everybody's trying to fight for the exact same thing. We want to be the money for this ecosystem itself. So I think like the first problem to solve is allowing these assets to move really freely across each other in different types of chains. And I think like Cosmos in some sense has done that to a degree through IBC and other like messaging protocols and messaging layers. The problem is like, IBC is path dependent. So if you go from chain A to B and from B to C, you get a different token than if you just send directly from A to C. And so those are like some of the annoying problems, right? You'll get like different wrapped versions. I think like Solana and like other chains see these problems as well with like USDC that's wrapped with like different bridges as well. And so I think that's what hampers a lot of the ability to like reduce this like liquidity fragmentation. So that's like one of the main problems that we want to solve, and we are trying to solve at Initia. Basically removing like this wrapped asset standard framework, having like a canonical standard of assets across all different rollups as well. And that's like kind of why our L1 exists, because it's like the orchestration layer basically serves as like the data pipelining or like the infrastructure pipelining for all these L2s or minitias. And so once you have that basically kind of, resolved to some sense, then you're able to work on like, what is the canonical asset? Where do we store this liquidity for this canonical asset? Is it on maybe one of these L2s, or is it maybe on that L1 layer, right? And so I think like one of the advantages of having an L1 with this whole L2 system is to be able to house like all of these assets as well as the liquidity for like the main asset in like a credibly neutral manner, right? So like it's not on one specific chain, it's just on the base chain.
Yeah, it makes sense. Let's talk about the product. So can you describe the product stack and what are developers getting when they build with Initia?
So there's a few different things. On the architecture side of the product, if you come in as a application chain developer, you have firstly your layer twos are essentially a full-fledged Cosmos chain. So you can change everything about the rollup itself on the Cosmos SDK side. Whether that means you want to integrate skipped block SDK, change the way that transactions are ordered, or if you want to add osmosises, DEX modules, or any other Go module, you can do that just fine. And then we've integrated 3 different VMs that we call the Interwoven VMs on top of this, that being EVM, MoveVM, and WasmVM. Fundamentally, we believe that VMs are tools. Whatever tool works best for you and your application is the one that you should use. And then ensuring that these VMs don't create fragmentation. So within Initia's framework, you can do cross rollup contract interactions. You can bridge between them. You can move from a move coin to an ERC20 to a CW20 just fine, and it all stays fungible. And then as a rollup, you are given almost everything that you would get on a monolithic chain directly to you through the layer 1. So that being native USDC and CCTP access, oracles that are streamlined to the layer 2s and are atomically fetchable from every one of those chains, wallet infrastructure so that you don't have to build it out yourselves. Your users can connect to any EVM wallet, any Cosmos wallet, in-app wallets, despite being in whatever VM you want. A bridge widget that aggregates all the flows from any EVM chain, Move chain, Cosmos chain, fiat on-ramp directly into your rollup. So as a developer, you don't need to say, hey, bridge to the initial layer 1, then bridge to my layer 2. You get a block explorer, and then you get things like the Initia app, which are kind of just like home ground places on the layer 1. So as a product stack, we think that initial rollups are the most flexible, but also the most product ready. You can really just focus on building your application and everything else is just solved for you from day one when you launch.
Is deploying an application on Initia permissioned or is it fully permissionless?
It's fully permissionless, so anybody can come and deploy whichever app chain they like, or like whichever L2 rollup they'd like, and with all the underlying tools, so the VMs, the specific Cosmos modules, etc.
Right. And so since things are permissionless and but then at the same time you have this high level of compatibility and interoperability and composability between applications, like to what extent are applications segmented or from other applications? Because like, is there an opportunity here for apps to launch on Initia that might be vulnerable that could affect maybe like other applications built on the platform?
So I think like the apps themselves, or specifically like apps built on these rollups or minitias themselves, are kind of isolated from each other unless they're built on the same rollup or same minitia, which is definitely possible. So in general, I don't think that's a risk. There may be some, concerns or worries about like liquidity. So from one, like assets from one L2 versus like assets from a different L2. So we do have like a whitelisting process on the L2 or on the L1 itself, and this is through the L1 governance to basically support some of the higher level tooling that is available to these minitias once they're bootstrapped a little bit off the ground.
Okay, so you're saying at the L1 level, the tooling there is subject to governance, but anybody can build an L2 that doesn't require any whitelisting or governance.
Yeah, so anybody can, I guess, like build their own L2 or Initia itself. They get all the access to the tooling itself. But for example, if they want to be participating in like our reward system, which we call VIP, then that has to satisfy certain like basic requirements of like the chain as well, and then go through the L1 governance to get whitelisted.
Interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned also that oracles are included in Initia. Now that's something that in a Cosmos chain is becoming like easier to do now with Skip, where validators can run essentially like the oracle for a chain. How does that work in Initia? Like, are you guys running Skip at the L1 level and sort of like producing price feeds for any chain, or are you using some other system?
Yeah, that's essentially right. So we've baked in Skip Slinky module directly into our layer one. So our validators feed new prices to the layer one every block that there is, so that there's fresh price updates. And then we have a relaying system that relays these price updates from the layer one to every layer two that is within this whitelisted set, and use the block SDK on those layer twos so that these Oracle updates are prioritized and they come in at the top of the block when they're relayed to the layer two. So about every 3 seconds, these layer twos will get fresh price updates. And what's nice about having these layer twos be full Cosmos SDK chains, if they decide that they want Oracle frequency to happen every 500 milliseconds, which is the speed of the layer two blocks instead of every 3 seconds, they can just throw the Slinky module on the layer twos as well. We've already integrated it. They just need to basically kickstart the sidecar. And then that would be perfect for things like perpetual products. But for the most part, things like lending products, anything else, the 3-second updates are totally fine.
Okay, so a couple of questions here. On the asset aspect, so does governance then decide which price feeds the Oracle at the layer one provides? Because like an application might need some like totally out there asset price feed, like if they're building like a perp or a DEX or something like that, right? Which might not be provided by the L1 Slinky. And then so maybe answer that first.
So Skip recently introduced this new thing called the market map module. This is essentially just like a very flexible module to Slinky that enables some administrators or some multi-sig basically to just like add new price feeds that they support instantly. And once that's added to the market map, it'll start instantly feeding. And then that same module exists on the layer twos. And so they can essentially trim down the number of price feeds that they want included on their layer two. So if there's Skip Slinky support for that asset, we can totally ship it to these layer twos. If it's something that's totally out there, they probably would have had to make a custom Oracle system anyways to include those prices, so they might have to do the same.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned earlier that L2s can integrate the skip module directly if they want faster update times. So the way I understand skip, and like we've had Magma on the podcast, and so like the validators run the skip module and the sidecar and provide that price update. Now that makes sense, at the layer one level because you guys have a validator set. Those validators are running those sidecars. So for the L2, who's running that sidecar, and is it sufficiently decentralized?
Sure.
Yeah.
So underneath every one of these layer twos is Comet BFT actually. So we already have decentralized sequencer sets. So you can have like 5, 10 sequencers, whatever you might want, and they can stake any asset, whether that be like a dummy asset to create like essentially a multi-sig, or whether that be your own native token or the init token or something else. And essentially those sequencers that are running Comet would be running the sidecar and pushing those price updates on chain.
Okay, so the L2s also have to run their own sequencer. That's not provided by the L1?
No, any L2 has to run a sequencer. That's the same
Right.
on any rollup framework. They can choose to run one sequencer or they can choose to run 10. That part is totally
Got
up
it.
to them.
Okay, and are you guys providing kind of like, some kind of like
Yeah,
software
we have
to
like
help
scripts and
facilitate
binaries
this? Yeah,
for all of
yeah,
that. It's pretty easy to do. And then we're also working with a couple of RaaS providers. So you can just like go deploy with one click. So we've already launched with New Metric. They power a lot of Cosmos Chain RPC and LCD infrastructure now. So I think
yeah.
they do most of Neutron's products as well as like Astroport, Mars, those sorts of things. And so on New Metric's platform, you can go click what type of VM you want, how many validators you essentially want on your sequencer set for the layer two, and then deploy an initial rollup on demand.
Okay, this is an aspect that I'm not super familiar with, right? So like sequencers and L2s, what's generally the best practice in terms of like how many sequencers is kind of considered to be sufficiently decentralized, and are there marketplaces where rollups can essentially like hire nodes to run as sequencers? Like, yeah, maybe
So at the
providing some clarity
moment,
there.
I think almost every rollup is a single sequencer, Arbitrum, Optimism, all of those. I think it's a process of decentralization. First, you typically start off as a single sequencer. Then you might upgrade to a decentralized set that is using a multi-sig style approach. And then you upgrade to one that has slashing abilities with some additional stake. I think that's where restaking also comes into play, essentially allowing you to create these external validator sets to create slashing conditions around like maybe one sequencer instead. So those are kind of like workaround mechanisms. But
Right.
on Initia, we already have jumped to the final step in that process that I mentioned. So you can have these decentralized sequencer sets. We typically suggest somewhere around 5, whether that be through a multi-sig style approach or through stake with slashing is kind of up to you. And then we're working on some restaking stuff as well, so that you can potentially expand that security to a much larger set.
Right. Again, so what's at stake here is mostly censorship. Right. So like if you're running a single sequencer, I mean, I guess you could censor transactions, but you wouldn't be able to like run off with funds or something like that.
Yeah, and I guess there's also the trade-off of basically like the more sequencers you have, or like in some sense validators you have, right? Like I think like performance drops off to some degree, like a very
Yeah.
small degree. That's just like naturally what happens with all communications. So like in general latency and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how well does Initia scale then? I mean, like how many roll-ups can Initia handle before, scaling limits, we start to reach scaling limits?
So it depends on how much activity is occurring on the layer one versus the layer twos. What's nice about vertical scaling is that essentially and this is what makes rollups very different from interchain security, is that the layer one validators essentially don't need to do anything for these layer twos. They're like completely separate processes. They only get tapped in when there's something like a fraud proof challenge that they need to come to consensus on. So for the most part, you could have thousands of rollups on Initia just fine. Bottlenecks can start to occur if there's like an insane amount of traffic going through the layer one. But for the most part, this should be a problem that we see maybe in a long time. And I think once we start to approach that problem, we're doing something right.
And so the layer one has, like, in addition to the Oracle, has some kind of enshrined protocols there. So I think there's like a DEX and maybe some other things. So what are the kind of services that are provided at the L1 level in terms of being able to like bridge liquidity from other ecosystems, being able to swap between different assets, etc.?
So the first is we've built a DEX directly into the chain. It has both weighted pools as well as concentrated liquidity pools. So this is the Initia DEX, and we've also then built something called liquidity. What this mechanism is essentially we stake init X token directly with our validators on the layer one. So we built a new staking module called the M staking for multiple staking. And you can essentially stake whitelisted pairs. So init ETH, init TIA, init USDC. And this builds a hub of liquidity for major assets that is easily accessible for every layer two on the chain. But also it acts as an inter-Initia router. So if you remember there's the pairwise dependency on Cosmos IBC. The way that we handle that is that all layer two to layer two interactions essentially go through the layer one so that the source path for any IBC transaction is from the layer one. So through the layer one. And because those paths go through the layer one, that liquidity there is like a prime venue for things like swaps. So you can send ETH from one rollup and get USDC on another, and you're not going to face high slippage because there's just a chunk of liquidity waiting for you. The second is we've included this forwarding module on the layer one that was introduced by the Noble team. And what this essentially does is just automatically forwards assets or IBC transfers. This was invented because with CCTP, what happens is you have a CCTP request from, say, Ethereum. It comes and it lands on Noble. That CCTP message can't have a memo field. And because of that, you can't instantly initiate an IBC transaction from Noble to some destination chain. And so with the forwarding module, that CCTP transfer deposits funds into a forwarding module account. It says, I'm going to automatically route this to some other destination. And so by introducing that forwarding module on our layer one as well, we can essentially do CCTP transfers with one signature on Ethereum directly into a rollup on Initia, which is really cool for UX. CCTP is like not a thing that you can easily get on a rollup because you need Circle to actually come and launch on you. But with the forwarding module as well as IBC, we can just do this pretty easily, which is pretty awesome. And then there is Initia VIP, which is essentially our reward structure to incentivize the usage of the init token across all the layer twos on Initia, build novel use cases, create that idea of init is money, as well as give these layer two teams additional means to attract users where they don't have to use their own tokens, and do it in a long-term sustainable fashion. So we have quite a few different interesting mechanisms on top of VIP that we can't share just yet, but it is pretty awesome for long-term reward structures that we've built out after seeing like tens of grant systems and how those have turned out.
A couple things here. So the interoperability between rollups, is IBC used at this point here? I mean, or is that just sort of like internal token transfers on the layer one?
IBC is used. So we've put in a packet forwarding module on the layer one as well. And so essentially you can send an IBC transfer from a given layer two include some messages in there to go to whatever other layer 2 you want, and then perform contract interactions. And what's cool
Okay, so
about having
it works
all of
also
these,
for other message passing like functions that IBC supports, not just token transfers. You can send
correct,
contract calls across. Right.
contract calls, NFTs, tokens, basically anything. And what's really cool is that we've been working with Skip and their API. So whenever a new Initia is whitelisted and added to the Initia registry, it gets auto-indexed into Skip API. And now you basically have like the full powers of Skip API directly on your rollup instantly when you launch.
Very cool. So then you can use like IBC.fund to bridge in like any token into
Yep.
a
Yep.
Initia.
And it has like all of its routing properties. It has all of its liquidity management properties. So I can say through Skip API on a given layer 2 that I want to go buy Osmosis or go buy stars on Osmosis, buy a sloth on Stargaze, and then bring that to a different Initia, maybe an NFT Initia. And that can all happen through just their multi-hop forwarding.
Very cool. So IBC, I guess I'm familiar with how IBC works between Cosmos chains and Cosm WasM contracts, but how do you get IBC to work between like an EVM contract and a Move contract?
So IBC, typically what happens for these contract interactions is there's just basically a message in the memo field that is saying like, okay, run this when you land on the chain. And so you can just do the same thing, and we've just allow you to put move messages in there or EVM messages in there. The big thing about these VMs was how can we ensure that there's no like dual asset layer? There's like something that you've seen with EVMs on Cosmos for a long time. And we did that by a pretty unique architecture by basically replacing our bank module for our move minishas as well as our EVM minishas with like a bank interface. Essentially, from Cosmos' side of things, it still thinks that there's a bank module there. But from the EVM side of things, it doesn't know that there's a bank module there. And in that way, you create like a seamless border between the EVM and the Cosmos side. So you can directly send tokens that are made as ERC20s on the EVM side out to another Cosmos chain just fine. And you can send Cosmos tokens into the EVM side just fine without there having to be like special things called.
Right, and so they appear on the other chain as like a CW20 or like what, like a Move token
Right.
natively.
And when they go out,
Right.
it's in ICS20.
Okay, interesting. And so you've had to do a lot of custom work, I guess, on the Cosmos SDK side for this to work. I mean, this and like I'm sure like other things. What other kind of custom work have you guys done? You mentioned this M staking module. Like, are there other modules you've built?
I think for the most part, the big ones were there's a lot of things that we did with IBC and packet forwarding to ensure that across all these rollups, you have the ability to hoop between them.
Yeah.
And then a lot of work on the VMs for both Move and EVM to integrate those flushly. And then also just some of those modules like the multiple staking. But otherwise, it hasn't been too hard. Cosmos SDK is pretty good and flexible. So we haven't had to like fork and patch our own version, but just create some of those modules and then build a lot of good product around this that taps into those systems.
And so specifically for EVM and Move, I guess for EVM, are you using Ethermint?
No, we've built our own EVM called Initia EVM.
Okay. And does it have any other kind of improvements over just simply working with the Cosmos SDK, or like are you doing like a parallelized execution or anything, stuff like that?
Not just yet. I think we're going to approach that later on. But right now, essentially, because all of these chains still use Cosmos SDK underneath, they are Cosmos chains. Just the VM that they're using is different. And that means like you're not running full Go Ethereum. You're just using it as a runtime, essentially, to run these transactions.
Okay. And you've also kind of created your own Move VM for the Cosmos SDK.
Right. So similar thing done there. It's more similar to Aptos's move than Sui's because Sui's requires some special interfaces for their consensus mechanism, but Aptos is a bit more standard vanilla-like move, and that can be easier integrated with Comet BFT.
You guys have this whole stack. I guess we've been kind of describing this stack called the OPinit Stack. This is essentially what we're describing here. Is like all these components that sit on the Cosmos SDK that make Initia possible.
So the OPinit Stack is basically our implementation of the optimistic rollup framework, and it follows similar design principles to Optimism's Bedrock spec specifically. So you can kind of just view like the OPinit Stack or like the OPinit Cosmos modules specifically as like the rollup modules that allows for these L2s to have optimistic bridges, has like the optimistic bridge contract, etc. Those types of things.
Okay, how similar is it to the OP stack or different? Like what's the main difference there?
The main difference is that it's built in Cosmos SDK. It follows the same interfaces because we wanted it to be as easy to use as possible. And so Bedrock and OP Stack are the most used one. And so we followed those ones, but underneath it's a bit different. So essentially there is a host module. That host module sits on our layer 1. And then there's child modules that sit on each of the rollups on Initia. And then there's just like a process that needs to be done to link the two. And after you do that, you create this trustless bridge between a layer 2 and a layer 1. And what that allows you to do is essentially, escrow tokens on the layer 1, have those be minted on the layer 2, and then have the withdrawal window on reverse with all the verification that needs to be done. So we have both essentially the optimistic bridge that lives between the layer 2s and the layer 1s, as well as IBC.
So right now you guys support 3 VMs, WasmVM, EVM, and the MoveVM. I noticed that the Solana VM is missing. Why did you choose these 3? And are there any plans to integrate the Solana VM sometime in the future, or other VMs for that matter?
Yeah, I don't think there was like any explicit reason why we didn't do this. I think like obviously it's pretty obvious that there's WasmVM, which is native to Cosmos, and then you have like EVM, which is one of the basically has the largest developer mindshare, right? And then we were also like internally very big fans of Move. We think it will be like one of the next generation languages for use for smart contracts as well. It's a Rust-based language, and I think like a lot of our devs have experience in that area as well. So that's why we kind of like included these 3. We haven't like necessarily gone into any technical specking about building like a Solana SVM implementation or anything like that. It's not completely out of the books. Perhaps when we're maybe a little bit freer once we've like launched public mainnet or so. But yeah, like that's like something we're definitely still actively exploring. Something that we definitely need to do more research with.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
I think,
and I guess like. Yeah, I mean, like in terms of developer mindshare, I'm a huge fan of movement too, of Move as well. Like we invested in movement and like really also think that the Move VM will play a huge role in attracting developers and I think it's just like a net benefit for the space, right? As a very like secure, formally verified VM. But Solana VM also has like tons of developer mindshare. And it might be interesting to also bring more attention to Cosmos from the Solana side.
Right. It's difficult to say because, I thought the first smart contracting language I learned was WasmVM. I thought it was incredibly based. It's very easy framework to understand. It's fully using Rust, has incredible security properties. But then we saw the adoption cycle of it over the last cycle, and it was slower than I imagined. And I think the same thing is occurring with Move, right? Like it's an awesome language. It's by far the easiest to learn. It essentially unlocks object-oriented programming, but we have not seen explosive growth of it yet. So I think there are reasons why we think of VMs as tools rather than like, this is the one that should be used, because there's trade-offs for all of them, whether it just be like mind share, ease of use, security. And that's a reason why we would want to include more and more VMs over time, because I think that's the most interesting layer to customize on, because it changes the types of applications that can be built. Things like different DA layers or interoperability solutions, I don't think those move the needle as far. And that's why within our architecture system that we've built here, we've just like chosen one really good partner for each of these, whether that be like Celestia for DA or IBC for messaging, and just integrated those very well. So that once you come into Initia, it's now the Garden of Eden, and you can change the different things that you want about your rollup, change whatever VM you want, but everything else just kind of works out of the box. And the choices over some of those other components, I don't think are like very valuable, aside from, am I going to farm the next airdrop for this other DA layer?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, like, one thing I was thinking about is, currently, if you're a developer and you're choosing which environment to build on, it's mostly a function of which ecosystem you want to be a part of. I think, if you want to go get ETH liquidity, you're going to build, either on Ethereum or potentially on an Ethereum rollup. If you want like Move liquidity, you'll go build on Movement or on Aptos. If you want Cosmos liquidity, you'll like build some roll up on Celestia or like go build your own app chain. But here, those considerations kind of go away because you're using the underlying layer one. You're benefiting from all the developer tools, all of the enshrined applications, like the DEX, the Oracle, the enshrined liquidity that's on the L1. And then it's mostly just, okay, like which language do I prefer to write in, or which existing code or like repos might I want to use, like existing contracts might I want to use for my app. Are there other things that developers should be considering, like building an EVM application on Initia? Does that also enable an application to be closer to the Ethereum ecosystem or the EVM ecosystem generally, even though they are part of like the Initia ecosystem?
Yes, I think like the goal of these rollups and the reason why we call them interwoven rollups that are being built on Initia is that regardless of which VM you choose, right, you'll be able to connect with like the outside ecosystem, right? So if you're, an EVM based rollup, you'll be very easily able to connect with like Ethereum or like other Ethereum L2s. And then through like the underlying Cosmos SDK itself, you're able to connect with all these other rollups that may have different VMs itself. But yeah, like I think like in general, when rollups choose like which VM they want to use and for their application, it's a function of just like ecosystem alignment, right? Like we are Ethereum aligned, we are Solana aligned, etc. And then it's a little bit less so for like the actual tech itself. There may be some specific cases where you want like parallelization or something like that, or specific use cases. But in general, we just kind of view these VMs as tools. Just choose whatever fits for you. You choose your VM, and then you're interconnected with the rest of the ecosystem, whether that's Initia or like outside of the Initia ecosystem.
Yeah. How do you guys compete with other roll-up as a service products? Saga, Dimension, AltLayer. I mean, there's like a whole bunch of them. How do you differentiate? And what is the thing that people should take away from this podcast?
I think a vast majority of rollups as a service, they make their money by essentially charging fees, right? They charge dollars to use their infrastructure, and that's kind of not something that we want to do. Like these rollups are permissionless to deploy, and they don't cost very much either. And so rather, by owning this layer one, layer two entire system, we don't have to be that middleman that's just trying to siphon money. Rather, we're just trying to grow like the collective pie and create more value for Initia as a whole and its stakers, which is incredibly nice. When you look more so at some of the other ones that are less like just RaaS providers, I think we differentiate on a few different things. Firstly, I think our tech stack is like the best one that there is. Secondly, I think we have a huge emphasis on product, ecosystem, and incentive design. I think architecture is great, but everything else is built to hide the architecture, because that shouldn't be like the biggest reason why you choose to build somewhere. It's like, table stakes at this point. You should have good architecture. And so the product, the incentive, the focus on building the ecosystem is really what's going to take Initia to the next level and set us apart. If you have had a chance to play around with public testnet, you've probably been able to see the Initia app, what our Explorer looks like, how you connect to wallets, what bridging is done like. All of the integrations are just very seamless. And those are all just like additional tools that these rollups can not worry about and just launch with. The second is the incentive mechanism design. So Initia VIP, I think, is the secret sauce that kind of ties everything together. And if you're not thinking about like the long-term way to grow these layer 2 applications, and you're just thinking about the layer 1, you're going to lose. The reason is we win by having layer 2s on Initia win. This is why any ecosystem wins, right? We are infrastructure developers, but it's the apps that are going to drive the users and the demand. If you look at any good ecosystem, Arbitrum was things like GMX, maybe like Magic DAO, Optimism, Synthetics, and Velodrome. Like you want to put your best foot forward to have killer apps, and all you should be doing is trying to support them as much as you can, whether that be on go-to-market, tech, marketing, incentives. Like that is our entire goal for teams building with us, and I think that user focus is like what sets our team apart as well. And I think that is seen by the ecosystem that we've already built. Like we just launched Testnet earlier this week. We launched that with 3 live layer 2s built by external teams that are insane, as well as 3 additional ones that are coming over the next couple of months. Like these are also not just like little UniV2 forks, like they're building new interesting things, right? There's Blackwing. They are building essentially DEX abstraction, as well as through their perpetual product. So through their limitless pool design with Intense as well, you can essentially do leverage on any asset on any chain with no risk of liquidation or Oracle risk, which is just like end game for how perps should be done. There's another product called Contro they're building, and they invented this thing called the Glob, gradual limit order book. Like that's some big brain stuff that I can't understand, but it is like what is supposed to be used to create really fair markets, slow down the time of them, and is perfect for like prediction markets. And prediction markets can be expanded to so many different things. I think they have a massive TAM. Then we have things like Milky Way, which is the first restaking protocol or staking protocol on Celestia. They're also building out some new interesting things for security, and I think that's going to be a killer layer too. And so I think the ecosystem that we've just been building over the past few months in closed testnet before being live is better than many existing chains already. And I think that's what's going to really help us win in tandem to the product stack focus and the product infrastructure.
Very cool. Yeah. I mean, so what can people do on the testnet? So you launched, I guess, as we're recording this earlier this week. What are some of the things that people can do to engage with Initia to, maybe get an airdrop at some point in the future or some special perks?
Yeah, I think like the Initia public testnet is basically just some time for like these applications that we've been working really closely with, as well as us, to basically test their products, right? With a bunch of new users, get users trying out these new products themselves, basically trying to get a feel for, the interwoven, let's say, modular ecosystem experience, like how you move assets between different chains or different L2s and Initias, how like bridging works, how we envision like how a modular, like a really fragmented world can be fixed using our infrastructure. We have a XP program where you basically, do different tasks around the Initia ecosystem, get XP points, use those XP points to basically get food for your dog, which the dog is called Jenny, and you kind of level up the NFT over several weeks during the testnet itself. So we kind of like made it a little bit fun, a little bit gamified. There's like a leaderboard to see who can level up the fastest and who has the most XP, etc. Yeah, just basically trying out like, level up your dog while trying out all these different types of ecosystem projects.
It's also, I think, way cooler than how Stan made it out to be. Like there's like layers on the on-chain Jenny system. It's basically on-chain Tamagotchi, right? You have to like decide what type of food you're going to buy her. There's like all these different lottery machines that have different, randomness of what food you're going to get. You have to figure out when you're going to feed her because you can only feed her once per week. So you don't want to skimp. And then it really just pushes our users into our layer 2 teams so that they can go check those out and grow those projects. Because like I said, like the way we win is by helping our layer 2s win. So we don't care about having our testnet users create like 1,000 random rollups that are like useless. Rather, we care about like, let's get our users into the hands of these layer 2 projects and incentivize that. And so now on public testnet, we have had, I think we're about 72 hours in now. We have over 260,000 unique wallets that have played with this. Over 4,500,000 transactions on the chain. Over 7 networks live, including the Initia layer 1. And this is this is all with like an incredibly difficult faucet experience. So I'm pretty sure these are real people.
Yeah, I tried it, and I could tell you the faucet experience was a bit cumbersome. I was not able to get my my init tokens, but I will prevail.
Exactly. So the bots are certainly prevented. So I'm pretty happy with the results so far, and things are looking really good. We've been getting some awesome feedback, and it's just amazing to see because we've been working on this for about a year and a half. We haven't showed anyone like the products that we were building, and I think that's a lot of the stuff where we shine. So incredibly grateful to the entire Initia militia for hanging out with us and playing with the initiation.
Cool, guys, thanks so much. Where can people go to build their Jenny and get involved in the public testnet?
Everything is live on initia.xyz. So just go to our homepage and then that will link you to the application itself. And then everything is explained on the application.
Excellent. Well, everybody should go to initia.xyz and break their servers and try to get these faucet inits. Cool, guys. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate it, sir.